I sat at the dinner table where my wife and I had shared decades of meals. My daughter slid papers across the table and said, "Dad, just sign them. You're too old to manage all that money." Her words cut deeper than any knife. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. What she didn't know was that Marjorie had left me a letter, warning me this day would come, and I had kept it safe, waiting for the moment to turn their lies against them. When I raised my glass that night, I didn't toast to family. I toasted to the truth I was about to reveal. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The winter wind off the Charleston coast rattled the old shutters, carrying the kind of chill that seeps into a man's bones. 2 months had passed since Marjorie's funeral, yet her absence clung to every corner of the seaside house we had shared for 42 years. The leather chair she favored by the window sat untouched, her perfume still faint on the cushions. Nights felt longer, mornings colder, and meals quieter than I ever imagined they could be. When Darlene called to arrange a family dinner, I thought perhaps it was her way of softening the silence. Maybe she finally understood what loneliness felt like and wanted to bridge the gap between us. I prepared myself, straightened the silver my wife had polished so many times, and told myself this dinner could be the first sign of healing. But beneath that hope, unease stirred. Darlene's tone on the phone had been clipped, businesslike, not the voice of a daughter reaching out, but of someone with an agenda. Arthur Maddox arrived first, his briefcase polished as if it had been buffed that very morning. He greeted me with his usual firm handshake and grave eyes. "Franklin, are you ready?" he asked quietly, like a man bracing me for impact. When everyone had gathered in the parlor, Arthur cleared his throat and opened Marjorie's will. The sound of those crisp pages made my chest tighten. He read her words slowly, carefully, each syllable carrying weight. My name, Franklin Devereaux, stood alone as the sole inheritor of her estate. $50 million, the sum of years of careful investments, properties, and her family's old fortune. The room shifted in that moment. Darlene's lips stretched into a smile too wide, her eyes fixed on me with a hardness she didn't bother to hide. Curtis leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if the revelation merely confirmed what he already expected. "Well," he said smoothly, "what's best for the family is always what matters most." It was a strange way to respond to his mother-in-law's final wishes. The words hung heavy in the air, turning Marjorie's gift into a battlefield before it could even be received. Dinner followed in the dining room, where Marjorie's oak table stretched beneath the chandelier she had chosen decades ago. For years, the head seat had been mine, the place she insisted I take as the father of the family. Tonight, however, Darlene placed Curtis at that end. She moved with authority, pulling out the chair for him as if it had been his all along. I said nothing. My hand brushed the back of that chair for a moment, then slid to a quieter seat along the side. Shelby's small voice cut through the clinking of silverware. "Grandpa, why aren't you sitting in your chair?" No one answered her. The silence was louder than any reply could have been. Darlene busied herself pouring wine. Curtis cleared his throat, and I felt the weight of humiliation settle in my chest. The chair was just wood and upholstery, but tonight it was also power, respect, and the memory of my wife's insistence that I always sit there. As the conversation circled around meaningless small talk, my mind drifted to Marjorie's words, whispered in quiet moments of our marriage. "Franklin," she once told me, "your dignity is worth more than any fortune. Never let them take it from you." Her voice echoed inside me now, mingling with the ache of loss and the sting of this new betrayal. The toast came near the end of the meal. Darlene rose with her glass high, her words honeyed yet sharp. "To new beginnings," she declared, "and to the leadership our family will need moving forward." Curtis's glass clinked against hers, his eyes finding hers with an expression that needed no explanation. That glance told me more than any speech ever could. This was not a shift of respect, but a transfer of control they had already plotted. The laughter of others in the room sounded distant, as though muffled through walls. I stayed silent, observing, storing every detail. The chill that began with the ocean wind now ran deeper, through marrow and memory alike. I knew then that the seat they had taken from me was only the beginning. The morning sunlight crept through the blinds, but it didn't bring comfort. The echoes of last night's humiliation still clung to the house like a damp fog. The sound of waves outside my window, once steady and calming, now felt like a reminder of how quickly things could shift beneath me. My solitude had become fragile, exposed. The sharp knock on the front door came earlier than expected. I wasn't ready for company, but when I opened it, Darlene and Curtis stepped inside without hesitation, their smiles tight, rehearsed. Curtis carried a slim leather folder under his arm, and Darlene clutched her purse as though it held the keys to my future. They didn't bother with small talk. Curtis placed the folder squarely on the table in my kitchen, pulling out papers with deliberate precision. Darlene leaned forward, her voice soft, almost syrupy. "Dad, we know things have been hard since Mom passed. We just want to make sure you don't have to worry about anything. This will take the burden off you." My eyes fell on the bold heading, Power of Attorney. My hands rested on the table, still, but inside, my chest tightened. The same table where Marjorie and I had shared meals, where we'd spoken about dignity, now held documents meant to strip that very dignity away. Curtis slid a pen across the surface. "It's only a formality. Just sign, and you won't have to deal with all the estate mess. I'll handle the bank, the taxes, the legal matters. You can enjoy your time without stress." Their words carried a strange urgency, as though they feared delay. I leaned back in my chair, watching them. "Your mother trusted me to take care of this family," I said quietly. "I won't betray that trust." Darlene's smile faltered, replaced by something sharper. She sat down across from me, her voice lowering. "Dad, don't you trust me? After all I've done? It's just for convenience. I mean, you're almost 80. What if something happens? Do you really want everything tied up in courts while you're gone?" The guilt in her words struck like a blade, but it wasn't subtle enough to hide the hunger beneath. Shelby wandered into the room just then, still in her pajamas, hair messy from sleep. She rubbed her eyes, glancing at the papers. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart," Darlene snapped, too quickly. Shelby's gaze shifted from her mother to me, sensing the unease. The innocence in her eyes made the tension heavier. I folded the papers slowly and pushed them back across the table. "Not today. Not ever. This conversation is over." The silence stretched. Curtis's jaw tightened, and Darlene's cheeks flushed with frustration. Without another word, they gathered their things and stormed out, leaving the house colder than when they'd arrived. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to clear my head. The streets of Charleston still carried the charm Marjorie loved. The cobblestones, the wrought iron balconies, the Spanish moss hanging from trees. But even here, her absence weighed heavy. I stopped at the market for bread, and an old neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, touched my arm gently. "Franklin," she said in a lowered voice, "I heard. Well, people are saying you might not be able to manage things alone anymore, that you're slipping." Her concern felt genuine, but the words pierced me deeper than she realized. I understood then. Darlene's poison had already spread. By evening, the phone rang less. Friends I'd known for decades didn't return calls. A couple of messages on the machine sounded hesitant, guarded. My circle was shrinking, not by chance, but by design. When the house grew quiet again, I noticed the red light blinking on the answering machine. Pressing play, I heard Darlene's voice, sharp and deliberate. "Dad, if you don't sign soon, you'll regret it." The message lingered in the silence, colder than the February night outside, that night. Her words echoed louder than the ocean outside my window. The brunch was set at a quiet cafe near the harbor, one of those places where sunlight streamed through wide windows and the smell of coffee and baked bread usually brought comfort. That morning, however, the air felt different. I walked in with a heaviness in my chest. Knowing Darlene had insisted on organizing this gathering, a part of me hoped it was her way of making amends after the tension of the past weeks. Yet, the way her eyes barely met mine when I arrived, the clipped tone in her voice, told another story. Curtis gave a practiced smile, Shelby waved shyly, and the rest was silence hanging like a storm waiting to break. We sat at a round table, the kind meant to bring people closer together. Instead, every word spoken seemed to widen the distance. Darlene asked about the estate with an edge to her voice, while Curtis pretended to sip his coffee slowly, his gaze flicking back and forth like he was measuring the room. Shelby, young and unaware of the battles underneath, chatted about school projects, her innocence both a relief and a knife twisting deeper. My hands rested on the table, but my mind was back at home, where Marjorie once insisted that family meals were sacred, where warmth was expected, not suspicion. It didn't take long for the moment to come. Darlene leaned back, her tone cutting, each word chosen like a blade. Dad, let's be honest, you're too old to understand what real responsibility means anymore. The sentence dropped into the middle of the table like broken glass. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. Shelby looked at her mother with confusion, as if trying to decide whether it was meant as a joke. Curtis didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head, letting the insult linger in the air without challenge. I wanted to speak, to rise, to tell her that age didn't rob a man of his judgment or his dignity, but the weight of her words pressed hard. Swallowing them was like swallowing fire. To fight her there, in front of her daughter, would have meant tearing down the fragile veil of family we still had left. Silence was my choice, but inside, the echo of her insult carved deeper than she could have imagined. The waiter brought plates of eggs, biscuits, and steaming coffee, but the taste of food was lost. My eyes drifted across the table and then caught on something that froze me more than her words. Around Darlene's neck gleamed a silver locket, small but unmistakable. Marjorie's locket. I had placed it in my study after the funeral, wrapped in a velvet cloth, meant to remain untouched until I could bear to hold it again. Yet here it was, resting against my daughter's skin as though it had always belonged to her. The room seemed to tilt. I asked gently, though my voice betrayed the tremor beneath. That locket, where did you find it? Darlene barely paused between bites of toast. It was always meant for me, Dad. Mom would have wanted it this way. She said it with such certainty that anyone else might have believed her. But I remembered Marjorie's hands, trembling as she told me to keep it safe, that it carried our memories, our years together, our promises. To see it paraded so casually felt like another betrayal, this one quieter, but sharper. Because it wasn't about money, it was about memory, about erasing the place where Marjorie and I still lived together in spirit. Curtis raised an eyebrow, as if daring me to protest. Shelby asked if it had a picture inside, and Darlene quickly changed the subject, brushing off her daughter's curiosity with a distracted wave. I sat there, gripping my fork, letting the moment carve itself into me. If they could take this without asking, what else had already been taken from under my nose? Later, when the brunch wound down and Shelby ran ahead toward the car, I lingered near the table, staring at the crumbs left behind. The insult, the locket, the silence. They stacked together, piece by piece, into a wall I couldn't ignore anymore. For years, I had believed restraint was a form of strength. But watching my daughter rewrite the past and dismiss my place in the present forced me to question whether silence was strength, or whether it had become a shield behind which they dismantled everything I held dear. That night, back at my seaside home, the wind off the Atlantic rattled the windows. I sat in my chair, replaying her words, the look on her face, the glimmer of the locket. For the first time, I recognized a pattern. Darlene wasn't just careless or ambitious. She was deliberate. Each move was part of something larger. Undermine me publicly, strip me privately, corner me silently. As I poured myself a glass of water, voices carried from the hallway. I had left the door slightly ajar when Curtis came by to retrieve a folder. Now his low whisper drifted back. We'll move to the next step soon. The documents are almost ready. My hand froze. Every nerve sharpened. The locket wasn't just jewelry. It was a sign, a message even, that they were already reaching deeper into places I thought were still untouched. The realization settled heavy. What they had taken in plain sight was only the surface. I realized then the locket wasn't just a keepsake. It was a warning of what else they had already taken. The early spring air in Charleston carried a damp chill as I walked up the broad stone steps of Darlene and Curtis's house. Their home stood taller and shinier than mine ever had, grand chandeliers glowing through tall windows, a statement of success they seemed eager to display. I had hesitated when Darlene called with the invitation, but she'd pressed with such insistence that declining would only fuel more whispers about me being distant. So, I went, though something in me already knew I would regret it. Inside, the dining room was arranged with precision, polished mahogany, silver cutlery gleaming, crystal glasses filled with white wine. The smell of roasted duck and sweet potatoes filled the air. Curtis greeted me with a firm handshake that lingered too long, as if to remind me whose table I had entered. Darlene kissed my cheek lightly, already turning away before I could speak. A few neighbors were there too, people I hadn't expected. It wasn't just dinner, it was an audience. We sat, and after a few shallow pleasantries about the weather, Curtis leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "Franklin," he said smoothly, "have you given thought to simplifying your living arrangements? Downsizing? That big seaside house? It must be a burden to manage alone at your age." My fork paused above the plate. I could feel the eyes at the table shift toward me, their polite smiles masking curiosity. Before I could respond, Darlene slid in with her voice sharp as glass. "What Curtis means, Dad, is that the apartment you've been using, it's technically part of the estate. And Shelby will need it soon. She's starting her own life. We think it's best if you vacate it immediately, so we can reassign the property where it belongs." Her words hit harder than any blow. The apartment had been my refuge since Marjorie's passing, filled with her books, her scent lingering in the fabric of the armchairs. Now my own daughter was telling me I had no place there anymore. I steadied myself, forcing calm into my voice. "That apartment was your mother's favorite place. She would never—" Darlene cut in, her smile wide but her tone merciless. "Mother isn't here, Dad, and things have to move forward. You can visit any time, of course, but it's better for everyone if you understand your role now." The silence at the table pressed down on me. A neighbor cleared his throat. Another took a sip of wine to avoid eye contact. Shelby, sweet Shelby, looked up with wide eyes. "Grandpa, will you still live near me?" she asked, her young voice piercing the tension. My mouth opened, but no answer came. The weight of humiliation held it shut. All I could do was force a nod, pretending it was nothing, when inside everything in me shook. Curtis clapped his hands lightly, as though concluding a business deal. "Good. Then it's settled. We'll have someone help move your things." The room tilted slightly. My fingers felt numb around the fork. I heard laughter from another end of the table, muffled, awkward. Then the edges of the room blurred. I tried to focus on Shelby's face, but it swam away from me. Darkness swept in, sudden and unkind. When I came to, voices crowded around me, though none carried concern. Darlene's tone cut above the others. "You see, he fainted. He's too frail to manage on his own. We're only trying to protect him." A few guests murmured their agreement. Words like "poor man" and "shouldn't be alone" drifted over me, each one another stone on my chest. No one offered me dignity, only pity wrapped in judgment. I forced myself upright. Though my body trembled, I managed a sip of water, then silence. That silence became my armor, though to them it looked like weakness. The dinner resumed, with conversations tiptoeing around me, like I was already a relic sitting in the wrong chair. By the end of the evening, I rose carefully, steadying myself against the polished oak of the table. Darlene avoided my eyes. Curtis shook hands with another guest, already celebrating his quiet victory. I stepped into the night air, cool and sharp against my face, carrying none of the warmth I remembered from spring evenings past. I left their house with my dignity in tatters. But in that very silence, a clarity took root. Their plan was no longer guesswork. It was plain. The very next day, I returned to Marjorie's old study to search for something they had overlooked. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Marjorie's old study, though it brought little warmth. The echoes of the night before, the stares, the whispers, the moment of collapse, still weighed heavily on the chest. Sitting in her old chair, fingers brushed against the polished wood of the desk where so many evenings had been shared with her, reading or talking quietly about the family. For the first time since she passed, the silence didn't feel sacred. It felt suffocating, The humiliation lingered, sharp as salt water on a fresh wound. Yet beneath that sting, something stirred. A quiet strength began pressing against the grief. Their whispers at that dinner weren't just words. They were evidence of how far things had fallen. That realization became a turning point. No more pretending, no more quiet endurance. Hours passed in silence until footsteps broke the fragile calm. The door swung open without a knock. Darlene entered, Curtis at her side. Papers rustled in her hand, her chin lifted high. "Dad?" she began, her tone coated with forced patience. "We can't keep putting this off. The papers need your signature today." Curtis placed them flat on the table between us, his finger tapping where the ink should go. "It's just practical, Franklin. You know we can handle things better now. It's time." The sight of the documents, so casually slid across the wood where Marjorie once left love notes, sent a jolt through the body. Heat rose in the throat, words forming before doubt could choke them back. "No," came out steady, sharper than expected. "I'm not signing a thing." Darlene's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You're being unreasonable." "Don't you trust your own daughter?" Her words sliced deeper than she realized, or maybe exactly as deep as she intended. Trust, that was the bond carefully tended for decades, now twisted into a weapon. "You've made it clear," the voice shook but didn't falter, "that this isn't about trust, it's about control." The air thickened. Shelby had wandered into the hallway, drawn by the raised voices. Her wide eyes peered from the doorway, confusion and fear flickering across her young face. "Grandpa, are you mad at Mom?" she asked softly, her innocence hanging heavy in the tense room. The heart twisted. The cost of this fight was more than signatures and papers. It was bleeding into the next generation. Curtis stepped forward, lowering his voice, but not his force. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Don't drag Shelby into this. Just sign, and all this tension goes away." "Out?" The voice rose again, stronger now. "Both of you. Out of this house." For a fleeting moment, silence reigned. Darlene's cheeks flushed crimson, her jaw tight. Curtis muttered something under his breath, gathering the papers before guiding her out. Shelby lingered a second longer, eyes full of questions, before following reluctantly. When the door clicked shut, the room felt both emptier and fuller, empty of their presence, fuller of something stronger than anger, resolve. Alone again. Hands drifted over the bookshelf, pulling out a worn volume Marjorie once loved. It slipped open, and tucked neatly inside was an envelope. The sight stilled the breath. Her familiar handwriting stretched across the paper. "For Franklin, if you ever doubt." Fingers trembled as the letter unfolded. Her words poured out, clear as if she were in the room. She wrote of her fears about Darlene's ambition, her worries that grief and wealth could twist loyalty into greed. She reminded that dignity and strength were his greatest tools. She urged him to guard the estate wisely, not for money's sake, but for the family's soul. Tears blurred the ink for a moment, but behind them came clarity. She had seen this storm coming long before he could admit it, and she had left behind not just warnings, but a lifeline. Clutching the letter, a new steadiness filled the body. Her words didn't erase the betrayal, but they framed it. What Darlene had done wasn't a lapse. It was a path she had chosen, and now, there was no question of standing idle. As the sun sank beyond the Charleston coast that evening, the letter rested against the chest. Its weight was light, but its meaning was heavy enough to hold up a man who had been crumbling. Her voice, carried through ink and memory, gave strength, but with it came a chilling certainty. The path ahead would be darker than ever imagined. The week after I found Marjorie's letter, the walls of Charleston seemed to whisper against me. At the cafe down on Meeting Street, where I had sipped coffee most mornings since retirement, heads turned in my direction. I could feel the shift, subtle at first, then sharper with each passing day. Snippets of talk reached my ears, neighbors speculating that I was slipping, that perhaps the estate was too much for me to manage. The words didn't come from strangers. They carried Darlene's phrasing, her rhythm. It stung worse than the winter air off the harbor. My daughter hadn't just challenged me in private. She had made my dignity a topic for casual chatter. I sat at my usual corner table, gripping the cup tighter than I should have, watching the cream swirl in circles as if it, too, were being dragged downward. The humiliation was not in the gossip itself, but in the knowing looks, the pitying nods. No one asked me directly. They just observed, waiting for evidence of my frailty. Every sip tasted bitter, though the coffee hadn't changed. That weekend, I attended a neighborhood gathering at an old friend's porch near Battery Park. The spring air carried salt from the sea, and lanterns flickered as laughter rose. I had hoped the familiar warmth might offer relief, but instead, it became the stage for my daughter's performance. Darlene stood with a glass of wine, her smile polished, her tone just sweet enough to pass as concern. She told them, gently of course, that I wasn't quite myself anymore, that managing $50 million in several properties was a heavy load for a man his age. The words landed like knives wrapped in velvet. People shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between her and me. Curtis stood beside her, nodding solemnly, adding that I had been forgetful lately. The false sympathy was worse than open hostility. It painted me as a burden, not just to them, but to everyone within earshot. My heart pounded so loudly I thought others might hear it, but I didn't speak. Silence had always been my shield, though tonight it felt like a weight pressing me into the ground, returning home. I moved through Marjorie's study in near darkness, the scent of her books grounding me. I pulled her letter from the drawer, the one where she had written in her careful script about guarding the estate wisely, about Darlene's restless ambition. Reading her words steadied me. I knew then that silence, though misunderstood as weakness, could also be strategy. I began writing in a plain notebook, every slight, every demand, every whisper I overheard. The pages filled quickly, ink carving out the truth they wanted buried. It was Arthur Maddox, my lawyer, who delivered the news that shifted my silence into resolve. He called me to his office, his tone grave. When I arrived, he laid a document on the table. My name was scrawled across the bottom in ink, bold and fraudulent. It was a property transfer I had never signed. I studied the signature, the crude imitation of my hand. For a moment, the room spun, anger colliding with disbelief. My daughter and her husband weren't just poisoning my reputation, they had forged my name, accelerating their scheme through the law itself. Arthur's voice was steady, but the weight in his words was undeniable. They're moving quickly. Franklin, this could hold in court if not challenged. My fingers trembled as I lifted the paper, the edges crumpling under the pressure. For the first time since Marjorie's passing, the grief gave way to something sharper, colder. Betrayal had many faces, smiles at dinners, whispers in cafes, forged ink on paper, and this one declared war. That night, sitting alone by the window as the tide rolled in, I whispered into the quiet, "If this is how far they're willing to go, then they've declared war." The ocean outside seemed to echo the words back, a steady rhythm against the shore. Silence would no longer be enough. I would gather proof, every scrap they thought I was too blind to notice. They believed my age made me weak. They forgot. It also gave me patience and memory sharper than any blade. The Sunday bells of St. Michael's echoed through the streets of Charleston, yet the sound no longer brought comfort. I sat stiffly on the pew, the polished wood hard against my back, listening as familiar voices dropped to hushed tones. They weren't praying. They were whispering about me. Words like mismanaged and irresponsible floated through the air, cutting deeper than any sermon could. My late wife and I had once been pillars of this community, offering time and donations, always standing together. Now, her memory was being dragged through the mud, and I was the target. I forced myself to sit tall, though inside my chest a storm gathered. Every glance that slid my way carried judgment. Some turned their eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. Others didn't bother. They had already chosen to believe the rumors seeded by my own daughter. When the meeting concluded, Darlene stood near the front, speaking with a group of parishioners. Her voice carried, deliberately loud enough for me to hear. "It breaks my heart," she said, hand to her chest in a feigned show of pain. "But Dad has been diverting funds. I worry about how he's handling things since Mom passed." The words struck like lightning. To hear her imply I was stealing from my own wife's estate, It was almost too much. I felt my hands clench around the cane I carried, my knuckles whitening. Yet I didn't rise. Not here. Not now. They wanted me to explode, to prove the image of an unstable old man. I managed to walk out with my head high, though inside humiliation boiled. Later that afternoon, the wound deepened. I arrived at a neighborhood gathering, an outdoor event with neighbors sipping sweet tea under oak trees. Normally, I'd exchange pleasantries, perhaps tell a story about the old days. But not this time. Darlene was already there, Curtis by her side, wearing that mask of false sincerity. When conversation turned to estate matters, she smiled thinly and said, "Dad's been spending in ways that don't honor Mom's memory." Gasps and murmurs spread like ripples in water. Curtis added, "We're just concerned he's not thinking clearly. Stress does that, especially at his age." He said it kindly, but his eyes glittered with satisfaction. I tried to speak voice steady, explaining that every dollar remained where Marjorie and I had planned, but as I looked around, I saw doubt flicker in their faces, doubt planted by my own blood. My throat tightened. I had always taught Darlene that trust was the foundation of family, and here she was, dismantling it in public. The weight of betrayal pressed against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. Days later, I saw the shift in Shelby, my granddaughter, once so eager to spend afternoons reading with me, now avoided eye contact. Curtis had gotten to her. One evening, as I tried to talk to her about school, she asked in a quiet, almost frightened voice, "Grandpa, are you sure you're not confused sometimes?" The words stung worse than anything Darlene had thrown at me. Shelby's doubt wasn't born of her own thoughts. It had been fed to her, spoonful by spoonful, until she no longer knew what to believe. I caught Curtis watching us from the doorway, lips curved in a smirk he didn't bother to hide. A week later, the blow landed. A letter arrived from the Estate Review Board. It stated that Shelby Bledsoe was willing to give a statement against me to support claims that I was no longer fit to handle family matters. I sat at my desk in Marjorie's old study, the paper trembling in my hands. The little girl who once reached for my hand during thunderstorms was now being used as a weapon. My daughter and her husband had turned her into a pawn, twisting her loyalty with lies about inheritance and responsibility. The pain was almost unbearable. Yet beneath it, something else stirred, a cold resolve. That night, alone in the quiet of my study, I spread my journals across the desk, page after page of careful records, bank statements, and notes I had kept over the years. Marjorie's letter lay at the center, her handwriting steady and sure. I traced her words with my finger, drawing strength from the woman who had always believed in me. If they wanted to trap me in a web of lies, then I would weave my own web, the truth, strong and undeniable. I would not let Darlene rewrite my life, nor would I allow Curtis to corrupt Shelby's future. As the house creaked in the night, my resolve hardened. The lies surrounding me had become suffocating, but I would not choke. I would use them, expose them, turn them against the very hands that spun them. I leaned back, whispering to the shadows of the room, "You've declared war on me. Now, I'll show you how a Devereaux fights." The Charleston County Courthouse stood tall, its columns casting long shadows in the early morning sun. Walking up those steps with Arthur Maddox beside me, the weight of 78 years pressed harder than ever, but so did a stubborn fire that hadn't gone out. Inside, the air was thick with whispers, every head turning as we entered. My daughter sat straight backed at the plaintiff's table, Curtis by her side, smug in his tailored suit. Shelby fidgeted between them, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to disappear into the polished wood beneath her shoes. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. Arthur leaned close, his tone low but firm. "Hold steady, Franklin. Today we speak truth." His words were simple, yet they anchored me. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge's gavel brought silence. Darlene rose first, confidence dripping from her voice. She painted me as an old man unraveling, insisting I could no longer manage the estate Marjorie left behind. Her words were sharp but rehearsed, each accusation crafted to sound like concern. Then came the stack of papers, false records, fraudulent signatures, laid neatly before the court as if they were gospel. Curtis followed, slipping into his role as if he'd practiced in front of a mirror. He spoke of my forgetfulness, of late bills and misplaced documents, spinning half-truths into a web of deceit. My hands tightened on the table, but I forced myself still. Across the room, Shelby's shoulders stiffened with each word her father delivered. The child who once ran to me for stories now sat watching me stripped of dignity in a public arena. When it was my turn, I didn't shout. I didn't need to, rising slowly. I looked directly at my daughter. The silence before I spoke carried more weight than Curtis's whole testimony. I may be old, I said, my voice even, but I am not blind, nor am I a fool. I raised you, Darlene. I carried this family when storms came, and your mother trusted me to guard what she built. If I stumble now, it's not age, it's heartbreak. Gasps rustled through the benches. Arthur then produced Marjorie's letter, the one I had found in her study. Its ink was faded, but her words were clear. A warning about ambition and the reminder that love was meant to bind, not divide. As I read aloud, my voice wavered, but did not break. The room shifted. Doubt began to settle over Darlene's performance. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Eleanor Voss, Marjorie's oldest friend, stepped forward. Her frame was frail, but her eyes burned with conviction. From her purse, she produced a small recorder. The judge nodded, and with a press of a button, Curtis's own voice filled the courtroom. Once we secure the fortune, Franklin won't have a say. It'll all be under our control. The words rang out like a hammer on steel. The room erupted. Lawyers, spectators, even the judge leaned forward in shock. Darlene's face drained of color, while Curtis shifted in his seat, his mask slipping into panic. Shelby's gaze shot up, wide and wet, locking on her parents with horror. In that instant, the lies unraveled. The neighbors who had whispered, the friends who had doubted, all now saw the rot laid bare. Arthur pressed the advantage, pointing out inconsistencies, hammering the cracks wider. I sat, weary but resolute, knowing the tide had finally turned. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order before announcing deliberation. The case was far from over, but the ground beneath my daughter and her husband had cracked wide open. As the session ended, I caught Darlene's eyes. For the first time, I saw something I had never seen in her gaze before. Not arrogance, not disdain, but fear. Walking out of that courtroom, exhaustion weighed heavy, yet a strange satisfaction followed. The battle wasn't finished, but a truth had finally pierced their armor. The silence in my Charleston home weighed heavier than the humid air outside. Days had passed since the courtroom clash, yet the echoes lingered. Marjorie's letter and Eleanor's testimony had steadied me, but the fracture in my family cut deeper than any legal battle could. Darlene's face, once familiar, now haunted me with its cold resolve. For all the dignity I had clawed back in court, the truth remained. I was living in the ruins of what used to be my family. Word of the hearing spread quickly through town. Some neighbors stopped by with casseroles or kind words, quietly reaffirming their belief in me. Others crossed the street when I approached, unwilling to risk gossip by standing at my side. The damage wasn't only to my name, it seeped into every interaction, every conversation I overheard in the grocery aisle or at the church pew. My daughter had split the community just as she had split the family. One evening, I stood on my porch watching the tide roll in, Shelby's absence aching more than Darlene's betrayal. My granddaughter hadn't called since that awful day in court. The memory of her averted gaze, the hesitation in her eyes before she followed her parents out, gnawed at me. She was young, impressionable, caught in the crossfire of manipulation and loyalty. Still, the silence from her cut through me sharper than Darlene's barbs ever had. The house felt emptier than ever. Each room carried Marjorie's memory, but also her absence. I caught myself talking to her picture above the mantel, asking questions I knew she couldn't answer. "Did I fail her, Marge?" I whispered one night, glass of bourbon untouched at my side. Or did she fail me when she raised a daughter like Darlene? The words shocked even me, but once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. Grief twisted into bitterness, and bitterness into loneliness. Then Eleanor Voss arrived. She came quietly, with the firm steps of a woman who had weathered her own storms. "Over tea in my kitchen." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp but kind. "Franklin, the recording wasn't the only thing Marjorie left behind. She confided in me more than you knew. I have letters, receipts, things Curtis and Darlene never expected anyone else to see." Her words sent a jolt through me, part relief, part dread. Proof of their schemes meant vindication, but also escalation. They would not forgive being exposed. Eleanor reached across the table, her wrinkled hand steady on mine. "You've carried this burden too long alone. Let me help shoulder it." For the first time in months, something stirred inside me that wasn't fear or humiliation. It was hope. The tide, long against me, seemed to be shifting. Yet tides are fickle things. They can lift a man up, or they can drag him under. That night, staring out at the ocean from Marjorie's old study, I clutched Eleanor's promise like a lifeline. Proof was coming. So were consequences. And in this family, consequences had always cut deeper than love. The weeks that followed Eleanor's revelations passed like a blur, each day edged with tension and an odd calm. The sea outside my Charleston home moved with the same rhythm it always had, but my chest carried a weight that wouldn't let up. I spent my mornings at the kitchen table with Marjorie's letter folded neatly beside my coffee cup, her handwriting a steadying anchor. Preparing for the next court session wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity. I had spent 78 years building a life, and I wasn't about to let my daughter and her husband erase it with lies. When the morning of the hearing arrived, the courthouse loomed larger than ever. The same halls I had walked weeks before felt colder, more judgmental. Darlene and Curtis walked ahead, confident, polished, their lawyer shuffling papers with a grin that made my stomach twist. Shelby trailed them, her face pale, her steps hesitant. I steadied myself with Arthur Maddox by my side, his firm nod telling me we were ready. Inside, the judge called us to order, and the air thickened. Arthur rose, his voice measured and unshakable. He laid down documents one by one, ledgers, notarized statements, signatures that bore my name but not my hand. The courtroom stirred as the falsifications became impossible to deny. I sat quietly, my gaze fixed on Darlene. For the first time, her composure faltered, her lips pressed tight, her eyes shifting nervously as each page stacked against her. My silence seemed louder than any outburst could have been. Darlene's lawyer tried to redirect, claiming clerical errors, but the judge wasn't buying it. When Arthur produced a sworn statement from a notary who admitted pressure from Darlene to overlook irregularities, the room turned heavy. Whispers rippled through the benches. I didn't need to speak. The truth was finally doing the shouting for me. Then came Curtis's turn. His arrogance filled the room when he first took the stand, trying to paint himself as a dutiful son-in-law only looking out for a grieving old man. But Arthur's questioning cut through his bravado. Checks appeared with his unmistakable signature. Bank transfers traced back to accounts in his name. A recorded voicemail, bragging to a colleague about securing the old man's fortune, sealed it. Curtis's face drained of color. Shelby covered her mouth, eyes wide, as her father's mask slipped away. Watching my granddaughter's tears in that moment was worse than any humiliation I had endured. She wasn't crying for me, or even for herself. She was crying because the image of her parents had been shattered. I wished I could have shielded her from it, but I also knew the truth had to be laid bare. Vindication always carried a cost. When the judge announced that final sentencing and asset rulings would come in the next session, the gavel's strike felt like thunder. The courthouse emptied, voices trailing down marble corridors. But I lingered for a moment. My legs ached. My chest felt tight. Yet I walked tall. Outside, the Charleston sun greeted me, brighter than I remembered it in months. I finally held the truth in my hands, but truth doesn't heal wounds as quickly as it destroys lies. The week before the final court ruling, Charleston's spring air carried the kind of dampness that clung to old bones. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it too were waiting for the gavel to fall. Marjorie's portrait above the mantel had become my silent companion. Her eyes, painted decades ago, seemed to watch over me as I reread her letter for the 100th time. Those words had become my anchor, reminding me that dignity was not lost, so long as truth remained. Nights stretched long. The ocean outside whispered with a rhythm that should have soothed, but instead it echoed the tension building inside me. Each creak of the floorboards, each distant car on the street, felt like a prelude to something inevitable. The world was moving toward judgment, and though I had weathered storms before, this one threatened to fracture what little family I had left. It was during one of those evenings, while the last light faded into the horizon, that a knock came at the door. My daughter's voice followed, tentative, almost unsure. "Dad, it's me." When I opened the door, Darlene stood there, her posture less defiant than usual. Her eyes darted around the entryway, as though searching for the strength to step inside. Behind her, Shelby lingered, quiet and wide-eyed, clutching her jacket with both hands. "I needed to see you," Darlene began, her tone softer than I remembered in months. She moved into the living room, her gaze brushing the familiar furniture, the portrait, the shadows that seemed to hold her mother's presence. For once, her words lacked their usual armor. "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and brittle. They sounded less like an admission of guilt and more like a plea to soften the blow of what was still to come. Her apology carried the weight of fear, fear of consequences, fear of judgment, fear of losing the fortune she had clawed so hard to claim. I sat across from her, hands clasped, eyes steady. My heart warred between anger and the instinct of a father to reach across that growing gulf. Memories flashed, holding her as a child when storms frightened her, sacrificing nights and years so she could have the life Marjorie and I dreamed for her. Yet here we sat, two adversaries linked by blood, but separated by greed. "You've hurt me more than anyone else could," I finally said, my voice low, deliberate. "An apology doesn't erase the scars. Darlene, not this time." Her face tightened, lips pressed together as though she wanted to protest but knew better. Shelby shifted at the doorway, and when I looked at her, I saw something rawer than Darlene's words. Her eyes pleaded, not for money, not for inheritance, but for family, for some sign that love could survive the wreckage. That gaze pierced deeper than any accusation. I realized then how much damage Curtis's manipulation had done, not just to me, but to the child who once ran barefoot across my yard, squealing with laughter at the sight of seashells I gathered for her. Shelby's silence spoke louder than her mother's apology. After they left, the house returned to its stillness. The apology had come, but it carried no true repentance. And though my heart still beat with love for my daughter, I understood something unshakable. The fracture could not be mended, the trust was gone, and no verdict could rebuild what she had torn apart. I sat with that truth, and oddly, a calm settled over me. The war had been ugly, but justice was unfolding. Whatever the court decided, I had spoken the truth and defended Marjorie's legacy. That was enough. Later, standing before her portrait, I whispered into the dim room, "I've done all I can, Marjorie. The rest is in the hands of the law and of God." The clock ticked louder than usual, each second dragging me closer to the moment when everything would be decided. When the gavel falls, it won't just decide money, it will decide the remnants of my family's soul. The Charleston courthouse felt colder than ever that morning. Sunlight spilled through the high windows. Yet inside there was only silence thick enough to weigh on every breath. My hand slipped into my pocket, where Marjorie's wedding ring rested. I rubbed the smooth gold with my thumb, drawing strength from it, as though she was still here, standing at my side. The benches were full. Neighbors, reporters, strangers eager to watch a family unravel. I sat tall, though every bone in me ached with the knowledge that this day would decide not just money, but the memory of a life Marjorie and I had built together. The judge entered, his robe sweeping as he ascended to the bench. My heart slowed into a heavy rhythm. Across the aisle, Darlene sat stiff, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Curtis wore his usual smirk, but I noticed the twitch in his jaw. Shelby sat between them, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in as if she wanted to disappear. The gavel struck once. The courtroom froze. After careful review of the evidence, testimony, and documents presented, the judge began, his voice steady. This court finds that fraud and undue coercion were committed in attempts to strip Franklin Devereaux of his rightful inheritance. The words struck harder than any insult or betrayal I had endured these past months. My chest loosened, breath coming easier, but the ache of sorrow mixed with vindication. The judge's voice pressed on. All claims against Mr. Devereaux are dismissed. Full control of the estate remains with him. Furthermore, Curtis Bledsoe and Darlene Whitlock are to face civil penalties and legal sanctions for their roles in this scheme. Curtis's smirk shattered in an instant. He slammed a fist against the table, drawing a warning glance from the bailiff. Darlene's composure broke next. Her lips trembled, her eyes flooded, and she buried her face in her hands. The courtroom murmured, whispers flying like a storm of ash. I didn't gloat. There was no victory in seeing my daughter collapse under the weight of her own greed. Relief, yes, but threaded with grief so deep it carved hollows inside me. Curtis pushed back his chair, standing with a violent scrape. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it once carried. He stormed out of the courtroom, his reputation in ruins, his career prospects stripped bare. Shelby sat frozen, tears running silently down her cheeks. Her eyes met mine for the briefest moment, filled with confusion, guilt, and something softer. Relief, perhaps. She turned quickly, unable to face me. Yet I held on to that fleeting glance. Somewhere within her, truth had pierced the lies her parents fed her. Arthur Maddox, my steady lawyer, placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's done, Franklin." Justice spoke today, but as the gavel struck again to adjourn, I understood what Arthur couldn't feel. Justice doesn't heal wounds as quickly as it destroys lies. Walking out into the Charleston sunlight, I felt the warmth press against my face. Reporters called out, voices eager for comment, but I ignored them. My steps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of decades of sacrifice, love, and betrayal. I reached into my pocket, holding Marjorie's ring between my fingers. I whispered so softly that only the breeze could hear. "We did it, Marjorie. Your legacy is safe." Yet, in my heart, I knew victory had its cost. A daughter lost to greed, a granddaughter scarred by deception, a family fractured beyond repair. Still, dignity remained mine. That, above all, was worth more than $50 million. As I paused at the courthouse steps, I turned my thoughts outward, as if speaking to anyone willing to listen. Protect what is rightfully yours. Do it with patience, with proof, and with dignity. Wealth can blind, but truth clears the eyes. Justice had prevailed, but the true inheritance I carried was resilience, honor, and the quiet strength to endure.